New York City once belonged to 5 powerful mafia families. Among them, one of the most feared and mysterious was the Lucchese crime family. For decades, they controlled unions, construction companies, trucking businesses, and millions of dollars in illegal operations. Their influence stretched across the entire city. Politicians feared them. Business owners paid them, and anyone who crossed them often disappeared without a trace. But like every mafia empire, their reign would not last forever. The fall of the Lucchese crime family was not sudden. It was slow, brutal, and filled with betrayal from within. To understand how this powerful family collapsed, we have to go back to the beginning. The Lucchese crime family traces its roots to the early days of American organized crime. In the early 1900s, Italian immigrants began forming criminal networks in New York. These groups slowly evolved into powerful mafia organizations. After the Castellammarese War in 1931, the modern American Mafia structure was created. 5 families were officially recognized in New York. One of those families would eventually become the Lucchese crime family. Originally, the family was led by Gaetano Reina. Reina controlled large parts of the Bronx and had strong influence in labor unions. But in 1930, Reina was assassinated during the brutal mafia power struggle known as the Castellammarese War. After his death, leadership changed hands several times. Eventually, a man named Tommy Gagliano took control. Gagliano was extremely secretive. He avoided publicity and rarely appeared in public. Under his leadership, the family grew quietly but powerfully. Gagliano focused on building alliances with other families. He kept his organization disciplined and low profile. Because of this strategy, law enforcement struggled to gather evidence against them. When Gagliano died in 1951, leadership passed to his trusted underboss. That man was Tommy Lucchese would become one of the most successful mafia bosses in American history. He was respected by other crime families. He was feared by rivals. And he was incredibly intelligent when it came to criminal operations. Lucchese believed violence should only be used when absolutely necessary. Instead, he focused on making money, lots of it. Under Lucchese's leadership, the family expanded its influence across New York. They controlled trucking companies, garment industry unions, airport cargo operations, construction contracts, and countless illegal gambling operations. One of their biggest operations was at JFK Airport. Lucchese members controlled cargo shipments worth millions of dollars. They could steal goods without anyone noticing. Electronics, clothing, and expensive merchandise disappeared regularly. But no one dared question them. Lucchese had built a criminal empire based on power and secrecy. For decades, the Lucchese family operated like a well-oiled machine. But things began to change after Lucchese's death. In 1967, his successor was Carmine Trementi. Trementi took control during a very difficult time. Law enforcement pressure on the mafia was increasing. Federal investigators were becoming more aggressive. New surveillance technology allowed the FBI to monitor mob activity more closely. But the biggest threat came from something the mafia never expected: their own members. In 1973, Carmine Trementi was convicted on drug trafficking charges. He was sent to prison. This created a leadership vacuum inside the Lucchese family. Soon, a new boss emerged. His name was Anthony Tony Dukes Corallo. Corallo was a veteran mobster with deep connections in the underworld. He rebuilt the organization and restored order. Under Corallo's leadership, the Lucchese family entered another powerful era. One of their biggest money-making schemes involved construction unions. By controlling labor unions, they could influence which companies received contracts. This allowed the mafia to dominate the construction industry in New York. They also participated in a massive mafia alliance known as the Commission. The Commission was the governing body of the American Mafia. It included bosses from the 5 families. Together, they controlled organized crime across the country. But in the 1980s, everything began to collapse. The United States government launched one of the largest organized crime investigations in history. The FBI secretly planted listening devices inside mafia meeting locations. One of the most important surveillance locations was a Jaguar car owned by Anthony Corallo. Believed the car was a safe place to hold meetings. He often spoke openly with his top captains inside the vehicle. but he didn't know the FBI had installed hidden microphones. Every conversation was being recorded. These recordings revealed shocking details about mafia operations, murders, extortion schemes, union corruption, and millions of dollars in illegal profits. The evidence became the foundation for one of the most famous mafia trials ever. In 1985, federal prosecutors launched the Mafia Commission trial. This case targeted the leaders of New York's 5 families. It was the first time the entire leadership structure of the American Mafia faced prosecution together. Anthony Corello was among the defendants. So were several other powerful mafia bosses. The trial lasted months. Prosecutors presented mountains of evidence, secret recordings, financial documents, witness testimony. The mafia's code of silence, known as omerta, was beginning to break. Some members secretly cooperated with investigators. Others were caught on surveillance tapes discussing criminal activities. In 1986, the verdict shocked the entire mafia world. Anthony Corello was convicted. He was sentenced to 100 years in prison. Several other mafia bosses received similar sentences. The commission trial was a devastating blow to organized crime. For the Lucchese crime family, it marked the beginning of their downfall. But the chaos inside the family was only beginning. Before going to prison, Corello secretly appointed a new leader. That man was Vittorio Vica Musso. Musso became the official boss of the Lucchese family. His underboss was Anthony Gospipe Casso. Unlike previous leaders, Musso and Casso ruled through fear. Extreme fear. They believed violence was the only way to maintain power. Anyone suspected of disloyalty could be executed immediately. Members of their own family were not safe. Between the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Lucchese family became one of the most violent organizations in New York. Musso and Casso ordered dozens of murders. Many victims were their own soldiers and captains. Paranoia spread. Throughout the organization, mobsters feared their own bosses more than the police. This wave of violence caught the attention of federal investigators. Law enforcement intensified their efforts to destroy the Lucchese family. Then, something happened that shocked everyone. In 1992, underboss Anthony Casso was arrested. Facing life in prison, Casso made a decision that would devastate the mafia. He became a government informant. This was almost unthinkable for a high-ranking mafia leader. Casso began revealing secrets about the Lucchese crime family. He described murders, extortion operations, drug trafficking networks. He even exposed corrupt police officers who had secretly worked for the mafia. The information he provided helped prosecutors build numerous cases. Dozens of Lucchese members were arrested. Many were convicted and sent to prison. Meanwhile, boss Vica Musso went into hiding. For years, he remained a fugitive. The FBI launched a nationwide manhunt. Eventually, in 1991, Musso was captured in Pennsylvania. He was brought back to New York to face trial, like Corello before him. Musso was convicted on multiple charges. He received a life sentence. With both the boss and underboss imprisoned, the family fell into chaos. Leadership constantly changed. Internal conflicts erupted between factions. Members began cooperating with the government. One by one, secrets were exposed. The once powerful Lucchese empire was crumbling. Their control over unions disappeared. Construction rackets collapsed. Illegal businesses were dismantled by federal authorities. The FBI had successfully weakened one of the most powerful mafia families in America. But the story of the Lucchese family didn't end completely. Even today, remnants of the organization still exist. They operate much more quietly than before. Their power is only a fraction of what it once was. The golden age of the Lucchese crime family is long gone. What remains is a shadow of the empire that once dominated New York's underworld. Their story is a powerful reminder of how organized crime can rise to incredible heights. But it also shows how betrayal, violence, and law enforcement pressure can bring even the strongest mafia families to their knees. For decades, the Lucchese crime family ruled with fear and influence. But in the end, their greatest enemy was not the police. It was their own greed, paranoia, and betrayal from within. And that is how one of the most powerful crime families in American history slowly collapsed. The fall of the Lucchese crime family remains one of the most dramatic stories in the history of organized crime. For decades, the American Mafia, also known as La Cosa Nostra, seemed untouchable. They operated in the shadows, a hidden empire built on fear, loyalty, and a strict code of silence called American. Law enforcement could chip away at the edges, arresting soldiers and associates, but the top bosses, the men who sat on the powerful Mafia Commission, remained ghosts. They were too smart, too insulated, and too powerful. How do you prosecute a king when no one dares to testify against him? The FBI was stumped. Then, in the late 1970s, they found their weapon. Not a gun or a baton, but something far more powerful. A tiny microphone. This is the story of how the FBI turned the Mafia's own words against them and brought an empire to its knees. The problem was simple but profound. To convict the heads of the 5 major New York Fanalista Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese families, prosecutors needed direct evidence. They needed to prove that these men were not just legitimate businessmen, but the board of directors for a nationwide criminal enterprise. Hearsay and the testimony of low-level informants weren't enough. They needed to be in the room where it happened, to hear the orders being given, the plots being hatched, and the profits being divided. But these rooms were impenetrable fortresses of loyalty and secrecy. The breakthrough came from a surprising source: the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO Act, passed in 1970. The RICO Act was a game-changer. It allowed prosecutors to target individuals for being part of a larger criminal enterprise. You no longer had to prove someone committed a specific murder or robbery. You just had to prove they were part of the organization that did. This was the legal framework. Now, they needed the evidence to make it stick. And that's where electronic surveillance came in. The FBI's strategy was audacious. They decided to bug the mob's inner sanctums. This wasn't easy. It required daring, covert operations, with agents, often disguised as repairmen or utility workers, breaking into mob-owned social clubs, restaurants, and even the homes of powerful capos and bosses. One of the most famous examples was the bug planted in the home of Angelo the Gento Donori, a key soldier in the Gambino family. Agents drilled through concrete and threaded wires, placing a microphone right in his kitchen. For months, the FBI listened as Ruggiero conducted business over his home phone, arrogantly believing he was safe. He talked about everything: loan-sarking, extortion, and even murder, implicating himself and, crucially, his bosses. Another legendary bug was placed in a black Jaguar owned by Anthony Fattoni, the boss of the Genovese family. Salerno loved to conduct business from his car, thinking it was a secure, mobile office. The FBI thought otherwise. They planted a bug in the dashboard, and suddenly, they had a direct line into the mind of one of New York's most powerful mobsters. They heard him discussing concrete-pouring rackets that controlled the city's construction industry, shaking down businesses and ordering his underlings. Every word was another nail in the coffin. These bugs weren't just isolated victories. They were part of a coordinated assault. The FBI bugged Paul Castellano's White House, his sprawling mansion on Staten Island, capturing conversations that revealed his control over the Gambino family. They bugged social clubs in Little Italy and Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, places where mobsters felt comfortable enough to let their guard down and speak freely. And what they heard was pure gold. They heard nicknames, hierarchies, and discussions of making a guy, the secret ceremony for inducting a new member. They learned the lingo, the structure, and the criminal schemes that funded the entire operation. For the first time, law enforcement wasn't just looking at the mafia from the outside. They were listening from the inside. The tapes painted a vivid, undeniable picture. They captured the day-to-day reality of mob life, stripping away the romantic myths. They revealed not glamorous godfathers, but greedy, ruthless, old men obsessed with money and power. The evidence was overwhelming. The Justice Department, led by a young, ambitious prosecutor named Rudy Giuliani, saw their chance. They would use the RICO Act and this mountain of audio evidence to do something no one thought possible. Put the entire Mafia Commission on trial at once. The stage was set for the 1985 Mafia Commission trial. It was a spectacle. The defendants were the heads of 3 of the 5 families: Fattoni Salerno of the Genovese family, Anthony Tony Dux Corallo of the Lucchese family, and Carmine the Snake Persico of the Colombo family. Other high-ranking members filled out the defense table. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on the secret recordings. 4 weeks, the jury listened to the defendants' own voices as they planned crimes, divided profits, and talked about their criminal enterprise. The defense lawyers tried everything. They argued the tapes were unclear, taken out of context, or that their clients were just big-talking old men, not criminal masterminds, but it was impossible to deny the evidence of their own ears. The jury heard Tony Corallo in his car, discussing who should be the new boss of the Colombo family. They heard Tony Salerno bragging about his control over the concrete industry. The tapes were irrefutable. They proved the existence of the Commission as the governing body of the Mafia and proved that these men were its leaders. In November 1986, the verdicts came in. Guilty. All of them. The sentences were staggering. 100 years in prison for Salerno, Corallo, and Persico. The Godfathers, the men who thought they were above the law, would die in prison. It was a devastating blow, a decapitation strike against the American Mafia. The message was clear. No one is untouchable. The code of silence had been broken, not by a person, but by a machine. The impact of the Commission trial cannot be overstated. It shattered the Mafia's aura of invincibility. With the top leadership gone, a power vacuum emerged, leading to internal strife and paranoia. Ambitious underlings, seeing the old guard fall, became more willing to cooperate with the government to save themselves. The era of the powerful, celebrity mob boss was over. The bug had done its job. It had turned the mob's greatest strength, its secrecy and verbal traditions, into its greatest weakness. Of course, the Mafia didn't disappear overnight. It adapted, splintered, and went deeper underground. But it was never the same. It was a shadow of its former self, weakened and wary. The great, centralized empire that controlled unions, politicians, and entire industries had been brought down, not by a bloody gang war, but by the patient, persistent work of FBI agents and the simple, undeniable power of the recorded word. It was a reminder that even in the darkest corners, the truth has a voice, and sometimes, all you have to do is listen. Thank you so much for watching. This piece of history shows how technology and strategy can change the course of justice. If you found this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into incredible true stories. Let us know in the comments what other historical events you'd like to see covered. See you next time. For nearly a century, an unlikely and dangerous partnership shaped the American workplace. It wasn't between management and workers, but between labor unions and organized crime. How did the Mafia sink its claws so deep into the heart of American labor? And how did that iron grip finally get broken? Today, we're diving into the dark, complex history of the mob and the unions. The story begins in the early 20th century. As unions fought for better wages and conditions, they often faced brutal opposition from companies. In this hostile environment, some unions turned to street gangs for muscle. Gangsters were hired as enforcers during strikes, protecting picket lines and intimidating strike break. It started as a marriage of convenience. The unions got the muscle they needed, and the gangs got a legitimate front and a steady income. But soon, this convenience turned into control. Take the International Longshoremen's Association, which controlled the bustling ports of New York. By the 1920s and 30s, mobsters like Albert Anastasia, the head of Murder, Inc., had infiltrated the union. They didn't just protect workers, they controlled the docks. Through violence and intimidation, they decided who got to work, extorted money from shipping companies, and used the ports for their own smuggling operations. If you wanted to load or unload a ship, you paid the mob. If you were a dock worker, you paid the mob for the privilege of working. This wasn't an isolated case. The same pattern repeated across the country in various industries. The most famous example is the Teamsters Union. Under leaders like Dave Beck and the infamous Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters became synonymous with mob influence. The union's massive pension fund, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, became the Mafia's personal bank. They used it to fund casino construction in Las Vegas, lining the pockets of mob bosses from Chicago to New York. How did they pull it off? Their methods were brutally effective. First, there was the infiltration of union leadership. Mobsters would either get their own men elected to union positions, or corrupt existing leaders through bribery and threats. Once empowered, they had access to the union's treasury and, more importantly, its pension funds. These funds were supposed to be for the workers' retirement, but the mob saw them as a source of easy, low-interest loans for their criminal enterprises, loans that were often never repaid. Then came the racketeering. They would demand protection money from businesses, threatening labor strikes or slowdowns if the companies didn't pay up. This was called labor racketeering. They created ghost employee schemes, where mobsters or their relatives were put on a company's payroll but never actually showed up for work, collecting a salary for doing nothing. They also controlled union elections through ballot stuffing and voter intimidation, ensuring their hand-picked candidates always won. The rank-and-file members, the actual workers, were often powerless. Speaking out could mean losing your job, getting beaten, or worse. The message was clear: stay quiet and play along. For decades, this shadow government thrived. The mob's influence peaked from the 1950s through the 1970s. During this time, it was estimated that organized crime had significant control over major international unions like the Teamsters, the Laborers' International Union, the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union, and the Longshoremen's Association. Their power seemed untouchable. Jimmy Hoffa famously taunted federal investigators, daring them to find proof of his connections. He was a hero to many Teamsters for securing great contracts, but behind the scenes, he was deeply entangled with the criminal underworld. His mysterious disappearance in 1975 remains one of the most enduring symbols of this dark alliance. So, what changed? How did this empire of corruption begin to crumble? The turning point came with a concerted effort from law enforcement, particularly the federal government. In the 1950s, the McClellan Committee hearings in the Senate, featuring a young counsel named Robert F. Kennedy, exposed the depth of the corruption to the American public. The televised hearings, where union officials and mobsters pleaded the Fifth Amendment, were a national spectacle and a wake-up call. This public outcry led to new laws. The most powerful tool was the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, passed in 1970. The RICO Act allowed prosecutors to go after entire criminal enterprises, not just individuals. Instead of just charging a mobster with a single crime, they could now charge them for being part of a long-running criminal conspiracy. This was a game starting in the 1980s. Federal prosecutors like Rudy Giuliani in New York used the RICO Act to systematically dismantle the Mafia's control over unions. They filed massive civil lawsuits against entire union locals, and in some cases, the entire international union. For example, in 1988, the government filed a RICO suit against the Teamsters. The result wasn't to destroy the union, but to clean it up. The settlement forced the union to accept government overseers who would monitor elections and root out corruption. For the first time in decades, Teamsters members had a real shot at fair democratic elections. Simultaneously, the economic landscape of America was changing. The decline of manufacturing and the deregulation of industries like trucking weakened the traditional power base of these unions. As industries shrank, so did the opportunities for extortion and embezzlement. The old-school mob bosses were also dying off or going to prison for long sentences, and the new generation of mobsters often lacked the discipline and reach of their predecessors. The workers themselves also began to fight back. Reform movements, like Teamsters for a Democratic Union, gained traction. Empowered by federal oversight, these groups worked from within to expose corruption and elect honest leaders. They risked their jobs and their safety to reclaim their unions from the grip of organized crime. By the dawn of the 21st century, the mob's stranglehold on American labor was largely broken. While pockets of corruption may still exist, the systemic, top-down control that defined the mid-20th century is a thing of the past. The government has ended its direct oversight of unions like the Teamsters, declaring them free of widespread mob influence. The story of the mob and the unions is a cautionary tale about power, corruption, and the fight for the soul of the American labor movement. It shows how organizations created to protect the working class were hijacked and turned into tools of exploitation. But it's also a story of resilience of dedicated law enforcement officers, brave union members, and changing times that ultimately brought a dark chapter in American history to a close. The struggle for fair labor practices is ongoing, but the days of mob bosses dictating terms from the shadows are, thankfully, behind us. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into history interesting, Please hit the like button and subscribe for more content. We'll see you in the next video. Ever heard of the Castellammarese War? It sounds like something out of ancient history, but this was a bloody conflict that ripped through the streets of New York City less than 100 years ago. This wasn't a war between nations. It was a civil war within the American Mafia, a brutal power struggle that would forever change the face of organized crime in the United States. So, grab a seat, because we're about to dive deep into the story of betrayal, ambition, and bloodshed that defined a generation of mobsters. To understand this war, we need to go back to the early 20th century. The Italo-American underworld was largely controlled by a generation of old-school bosses, known as the Mustache Petes. These guys were born in Sicily, steeped in old-world traditions, and frankly, a little out of touch. They were suspicious of anyone not from their specific Sicilian village. They spoke broken English, and they were slow to embrace new opportunities, especially the gold mine that was Prohibition. One of the most powerful of these Mustache Petes was Giuseppe Joe, the Bus Messier. Based in Manhattan, Messiria was the big cheese, te capo di tutti capi, or boss of all bosses. He was greedy, demanding a huge slice of the profits from every bootlegging operation, every gambling den, and every racket in the city. His power was immense, but his old-fashioned ways were starting to rub a new generation of ambitious, Americanized gangsters the wrong way. On the other side of this conflict was Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano was a different breed. He was also from Sicily, specifically from the town of Castellammarese del Golfo, hence the name of the war. But unlike Messiria, Maranzano was a more modern, strategic thinker. He saw himself as a student of history, a Julius Caesar of the underworld. He arrived in New York with a mission to unify the Italian gangs under his own, more organized banner. He quickly gathered a loyal following of fellow Castellammarese immigrants who were tired of being looked down upon by Messiria's dominant faction. So, the stage was set. You had Messiria's old guard, clinging to power, and Maranzano's ambitious Castellammarese faction, looking to take over. The tension had been simmering for years, but in 1930, Eat Boiled Aubert, the first shots were fired, and the Castellammarese War officially began. The war was less about grand battles, and more about a series of brutal, targeted assassinations. Gangsters were gunned down in social clubs, on street corners, and in their own homes. The body count rose quickly. Carcasses were found stuffed in burlap sacks, what the press morbidly called sacks of potatoes. The violence was so intense that it spilled out of New York, with skirmishes happening in Chicago and other cities, as loyalties were tested across the country. Now, caught in the middle of this bloody feud were the Young Turks. This was a group of up-and-coming mobsters who were born or raised in America. They were sharp, ruthless, and they didn't care about old-world Sicilian rivalries. They just wanted to make money and gain power. The most famous of these Young Turks were guys like Charles Lucky Luciano, Vito Genobis, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky. Luciano in particular was a brilliant strategist. He was officially aligned with Joe Messiria, serving as one of his top lieutenants. But secretly, Luciano was playing both sides. He despised Messiria's old-fashioned greed and saw him as an obstacle to progress. He also respected Maranzano's vision for a more structured organization, but he had no intention of letting Maranzano be the ultimate ruler either. Luciano and his friends believed the future of the Mafia was under one boss of all bosses, but a more democratic system. As the war dragged on, Messiria started losing. His forces were being picked off one by one, and his allies were defecting. Maranzano's side was gaining momentum. Luciano saw the writing on the wall. He knew Messiria's days were numbered, and he decided to accelerate the process. This is where one of the most infamous mob hits in history takes place. On April 15th, 1931, Lucky Luciano invited Joe Messiria to lunch at a restaurant in Coney Island called Nuova Villa Tomorrow. They ate, they drank, they played cards. It was a seemingly friendly meal between a boss and his right-hand man. At some point, Luciano excused himself to go to the restroom. As soon as he was gone, Forgunaman allegedly vetoed Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel burst into the restaurant and opened fire. Joe, the boss Messiria, was riddled with bullets, found dead at his table. still clutching the ace of spades. With Masseria out of the picture, the war was over. Salvatore Maranzano had won. He called a huge meeting of all the New York gangs to declare victory and lay out his new vision for the American Mafia. He proclaimed himself the new boss of all bosses. He reorganized the New York gangs into what we now know as the five families: Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchesi families. Each family would have a boss, underboss, and capos, all answering to him. It was a brilliant, hierarchical structure, modeled after the Roman legions he so admired. Maranzano was on top of the world, but his reign would be incredibly short. He had made the same mistake Masseria did. He underestimated the ambition of the Young Turks, especially Lucky Luciano. Maranzano saw Luciano as a potential rival and secretly planned to have him and Vito Genovis eliminated. But Luciano was always one step ahead. He learned of Maranzano's plot through his own network of informants. Before Maranzano could make his move, Luciano struck first. On September 10th, 1931, just 5 months after Masseria's death, 4 men posing as IRS agents and policemen walked into Maranzano's office in a Manhattan skyscraper. They were Jewish assassins hired by Meyer Lansky, chosen because Maranzano's bodyguards wouldn't recognize them. They disarmed the guards and then stabbed and shot Salvatore Maranzano to death. The Caesar of the underworld had been assassinated. Just like the original, with both Masseria and Maranzano gone, the path was clear for Lucky Luciano. But he didn't declare himself the boss of all bosses. He knew that title was a death sentence. Instead, he implemented the revolutionary idea he and his fellow Young Turks had been planning all along. They established the Commission. The Commission was essentially a board of directors for the National Crime Syndicate. It was made up of the bosses of the most powerful crime families from New York, Chicago, and other major cities. They would meet to vote on major decisions, mediate disputes between families, and approve or reject plans for assassinations. It was a corporate structure for crime, designed to prevent the kind of bloody wars that had just torn the city apart. The Castellammarese War, though brief, was a watershed moment. It marked the end of the old world, Mustache Pete era, and the beginning of the modern, Americanized Mafia. It swept away the old leadership and brought in a new generation of pragmatic, business-minded gangsters. The creation of the 5 families and the Commission provided the structure that would allow organized crime to flourish and become more powerful and sophisticated than ever before, operating in the shadows for decades to come. The war solidified the legacies of legendary figures like Lucky Luciano, who is often called the father of modern organized crime. It was a brutal, bloody affair fought on the streets of New York, but its impact created the very framework of the American Mafia that we see portrayed in movies like The Godfather and Goodfellas. It was a turning point, a violent birth of a new criminal empire. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into mob history fascinating, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. Let us know in the comments which piece of underworld history you'd like us to explore next. See you in the next one.